We are honored that you are here tonight. Now, a story that most Christians know nothing about is the story of how the church led out in the War of Independence. Most of us know that Christians had a major impact in the birthing of America. Most of us know that. What most of us do not know is that the pastors were literally the ones leading the charge. In fact, I'm convinced that the pastors really were the tip of the spear. Had it not been for the church, I do not believe personally that there would have ever been a war of independence. I don't think we would have ever separated from Great Britain, and I'm not sure there would have ever been a Declaration of Independence. You say, well, what would have happened? Well, who knows? But it was because of the church. Now, I didn't know this growing up most of my life. I have come to understand the pivotal role that the pastors played. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to do more than just talk about history. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about a time in history when the church literally did lead the way. In fact, after doing the research, I am convinced that it was the pulpit that helped to birth liberty in North America. Unfortunately, the 21st century pulpit is very different from the 18th century pulpit. And I often tell crowds that if the 21st century pulpit does not re-engage like the 18th century pulpit did, then the 21st century pulpit is going to help bury liberty in North America. There's a very big difference in birthing and burying. So, we're going to go back in time, and we're going to read about a time when the church literally did make the difference. And the reason why this is so important is not just because it's the history. I believe that we can repeat this history. And so this entire story, hopefully, will be a great blessing to you. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask you to put on a pretend travel hat, and I want us to go back in time. I want you to kind of settle into your seat, and I want us to go back in time, and let's talk about a time when the church literally was the tip of the spear in America, standing up for truth and for liberty. So, settle back. If those who are controlling the lights can turn those lights down, Paul, if you can bring the spotlight down, we will begin.
Like the black-robed preachers of the 18th century, Dan is a pastor who boldly proclaims the principles of liberty from the pulpit. As a leader of the modern-day black-robed regiment, Dan serves as co-pastor with Paul Blair of Fairview Baptist Church in Edmond, Oklahoma. Convinced that pastors have a biblical mandate to be salt and light to their culture, Dan has also served 2 terms in the Oklahoma legislature and was an Oklahoma gubernatorial candidate in 2018, all while remaining a full-time pastor. By retelling the story of the Black Regiment, Dan hopes to educate and mobilize today's preachers to engage in our culture war, just as the Patriot Pastors did theirs in the 1700s. Dan and Percussion Films produced the 90-minute video Bringing Back the Black-Robed Regiment, which provides a cinematic overview of the amazing story of the daring deeds of the original Patriot Pastors who stood against British tyranny. The accompanying book by the same title provides the more thorough, heavily researched backdrop to the story, must reading for anyone interested in a deeper understanding of the role the 18th century church played in winning America's independence. Now sit back and prepare to travel back with us to a time when the American church stood up for what it believed in, as we present Bringing Back the Black-Robed Regiment.
To the pulpit we owe the moral force which won our independence. They prepared for the struggle and went into battle, not as soldiers of fortune, but with the word of God in their hearts, and trusting in him. England sent her armies to compel submission, and the colonists appealed to heaven. John Wingate Thornton.
Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war, my fingers to fight. My goodness, my fortress, my high tower, my deliverer, and my shield. Our muskets leaning against the back wall speak as loudly as anything I might say this morning regarding our present crisis. Today we are called upon to either surrender our liberties, our religion, and our country, or to defend them at the point of the sword. There's no other choice. It's we who would gladly live peaceably among all men. We're now compelled to fight. It is therefore, my brethren, an indispensable duty that we owe to God and our country to rouse up and bestir ourselves, and being animated with a noble zeal for the sacred cause of liberty, to defend our lives and our fortunes to the shedding of the last drop of blood. We must turn our plowshares into swords and our pruning hooks into spears, and learn the art of self-defense against our enemies. Now, there are some who pretend it's against their conscience to take up arms in defense of their country. But can any rational being suppose that God requires us to contradict the laws of self-defense which He, God Himself, has written in our hearts? To be careless and remiss, or to neglect the cause of our country, will expose us to the displeasure of Almighty God. To save our country from the hands of our oppressors ought to be dearer to us than our lives. And next to the eternal salvation of our souls, it is the thing of greatest importance. A duty so sacred, it cannot be dispensed with for the sake of our secular concerns. The cause of virtue and freedom is the cause of God upon earth. To indulge cowardice in such a cause, it argues a want of faith in God. And he that is so lost to humanity as to be willing to sacrifice his country for the sake of avarice or ambition has arrived at the highest stage of wickedness that human nature is capable of, and deserves a much worse name than I at present care to give him. But I think I may with propriety say that such a person has forfeited his right to human society. The love of our country. The tender affection we have for our wives and our children do now loudly call upon us to use our best endeavors to save our country. Either surrender liberty or defend it. It is your choice. You see your hands, little girl. Dear congregation, I've been your pastor a good number of years. But the time has come for me to fight the good fight on a different battlefield. To defend liberty, both yours and mine. It is the right thing to do. And if I fall in the fight, I hope to see you someday in a land where the shadow of death will never again fall upon us. And liberty is eternal. Men, who will go with me?
I am called by my country to its defense. The cause is just and noble.
So far am I from thinking that I am wrong, Frederick. I am convinced.
It is my duty so to do. A duty that I owe to God and to my country. Well, that's what it was like to sit in one of our churches pastored by what we called a Patriot Pastor in my day. You see, I was a pastor in the colonies in the 18th century. I'd grown up in Pennsylvania. My father had helped to found the Lutheran Church in Pennsylvania. By the time the war broke out, I was pastoring over in a little place in Virginia called Woodstock, Virginia. You see, we preachers have been preaching for years the principles of justice and proper government. And we've been railing against tyranny. And we could see what was coming. And finally, we either had to stand for what we knew was right, or maybe forever give up our liberties. And so many of us pastors led out, and we fought. And I've been asked to come here this evening to tell you our story. We didn't want to fight. The last thing in the world you want to do is to be involved in bloodshed. But there are times, friends, when, you just cannot run away from conflict. And you have to stand. And we did. And there were a good number of us who took our stand. Now, I know you're probably wondering, well, what in the world is a preacher doing standing in front of us this evening wearing a colonial colonel's or commander's uniform? Well, we'll get to that in just a moment. I think first, probably the best thing to do would be to start off with introductions. So let me introduce myself. My name is John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. Now, that's kind of a long title, so you can just call me Peter. My friends call me Pete. As I said, I grew up in Pennsylvania. My father, Henry, really did help to found the Lutheran Church in Pennsylvania. And as I said, by the time the war broke out, I was already pastoring in the wilderness of Virginia, a little log church in a place called Woodstock. Now, I am honored this evening then to make your acquaintances. I don't know what your preachers look like in your day. But in my day, every one of us, when we got up to preach on Sundays, we got up there wearing our black robes. And so it didn't matter whether you were Lutheran, like I had grown up, or whether you were Presbyterian or Baptist or Congregational or Anglican, it just didn't matter. We all preached in black robes on Sundays, and so we looked something like this. And then, of course, we also wore our scarves, what we called our preaching bands. And so when we stood in front of our congregations on Sunday mornings, why, we looked something like this. And there we would boldly declare God's word. Now, please understand, we believed that the most important thing was a relationship that a man or a woman had with their Lord and Savior. We believed the eternal destination of men and women was paramount importance. But we also found in God's word much to say about justice, as I said a moment ago, proper government, and much to say to condemn tyranny. We preached on that too. Now, I know some of you are probably under the notion that we fought our war because of excessive taxation. And I will admit to you, taxation without representation. That was a familiar phrase in my day. We found the tea tax to be particularly onerous. In fact, it caused some of my friends to throw a little tea party down in the Boston Harbor, if you've ever read anything about that. But make no mistake about it, my friends, we were standing against what we believed was tyranny. And we knew that tyranny, unchallenged and unchecked, would come right into our churches, tell us what we could believe, tell us how we could preach, force us to be a part of the King's Church of England, and we weren't going to have it. And so even though we did everything we knew how to do to avoid it, eventually the conflict, well, it was thrust upon us. Now, like many preachers in my day, I didn't just pastor my congregation. Oh no, we believed that we were called to pastor our culture. And so I served in government. I served in the Virginia House of Burgesses before King George shut it down. I served there with some fine Virginians. You might recognize a couple of them. Mr. George Washington, a gentleman farmer from a place called Mount Vernon. And a man by the name of Patrick Henry, probably the greatest Christian orator I have ever known. In fact, I was there, March the 23rd, 1775, at St. John's Episcopal Church in Richmond, Virginia, when Henry gave that incredibly powerful speech. Why, it was so moving, it's like it was just yesterday. I remember especially the part where he said, "Is life so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, you can give me liberty or you can give me death." I must tell you, as he made that dagger motion to his chest, we realized just how serious the crisis really was. Well, I rode back to Woodstock and continued to pastor my church, but I realized the Lord was wanting something more from me, and so I announced to my congregation that January the 21st, 1776 would be my final Sunday as their pastor. It came time for me to preach. I climbed into my pulpit and I opened up to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There's a time for all things, Solomon says, but my focus was on verse 8, where Solomon said, there is a time for war. Well, I closed my Bible and I stepped down and I said, ladies and gentlemen, there is a time for all things. Solomon was right. There's a time to preach. There's a time to pray. But there is also a time to fight. And that time has now come for me. Well, I didn't exactly know how my people were going to handle the very next thing that they were going to see from me, because I stepped off to the side and I removed my preaching band, and then I pulled off my preaching robe and I revealed the colonel's uniform that you saw just a moment ago when we first began our visit. You see, Mr. George Washington and Mr. Patrick Henry had recommended me to be commissioned as a colonel of a brand new regiment that was forming in Virginia, the 8th such regiment out of our colony. And I was to be the commanding colonel.
And so here I stood in front of my men and women. Now, of course, they were accustomed to my being a pretty rambunctious soldier in the army of the Lord, but this, how would they respond? So I positioned a drummer boy just outside my church, and I told that lad, I said, now, son, when I open the doors of this church, I want you to lay into that drum. And so I walked back to the back, opened up the door. He began to roll on that drum, and then I turned around and I said, ladies and gentlemen, there is a time when we must stand and fight for what we believe in. Who will go with me? To my great delight, my congregation stood and began to sing that old Martin Luther hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." And if you can believe it, one by one, the men of my little church got up, went outside, and began to sign their names on the muster roll of the 8th Virginia right underneath mine. In fact, men from the community heard all the commotion, and they joined in as well. Well, not long after that, I had the privilege of leading those men off to fight, and I was their commander from that day, January the 21st, 1776, all the way to the end of the war, 1783. We fought some of the greatest battles of that war, and well, in just a moment, I'll tell you a little bit about that. But I want you to know that in addition to being a pretty good preacher, I turned out to be a pretty fair commander in the field, too. This is a painting of General Washington and his staff, and if you look to the far right, there I am. Lutheran preacher, now Commander Peter Muhlenberg. It's one of the greatest joys of my life to serve with General Washington. What a tremendous leader he was.
Peter Muhlenberg. He was brave on the battlefield, faithful in the cabinet, honorable in all of his transactions. He was a sincere friend and an honest man.
You know, it's like I can hear him speaking even today. Well, as I told you, we were at some of the greatest battles of the war. In fact, we were there at Yorktown. My men and I helped to assault Redoubt number 10, which eventually forced the surrender of the British General Cornwallis. There was a famous painter in my day named Mr. John Trumbull, and he painted that surrender ceremony. I understand that it hangs in the rotunda of your Capitol building in Washington City today. Well, if you notice in that painting over to the right, there's some of us gentlemen seated on horses, and if you look very closely, there I am, Lutheran preacher, now promoted to Major General Peter Muhlenberg. You also have something in your capital, I don't know that you know it or have ever even seen it, called Statuary Hall, where my home state of Pennsylvania chose me as one of their honorees, and there I stand today in your capital in Washington City, sword sheathed to the left. But notice flowing over my right arm and behind me, the robe that I laid aside to lead the 8th. You might say that I laid aside my preaching robe to wear a pair of riding spurs, because off to the war we went. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea that it was just a handful of us hotheads, and other than that, all the other preachers stayed neutral. Oh no, the truth is, there were preachers from every denomination who were involved in our effort, and literally, well, scads of us. Many of us across the colonies. The Presbyterians were particularly fiery in my day. Now, I don't know what Presbyterians are like in your time, but in my day, the Presbyterians were the hotheads. They were the fiery preachers. And one of those Presbyterians was this gentleman right here. This is James Caldwell. He pastored over in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Now, to give you an idea of what this gentleman was like, we believe that sometimes he said things just to, well, from his pulpit to make the British mad on purpose. Why, he'd say things like, sometimes it is as righteous to fight as it is to pray. Well, if he intended to stir up the British against him, he succeeded because they put a bounty out on his head. So what would Caldwell do? Well, his response was every Sunday morning when he would walk up to preach in his pulpit, he had a couple of loaded flintlock pistols hooked in his belt like this. He'd step behind his pulpit, pull them out, lay them on the pulpit where everybody could see them, open his Bible and preach. When he was finished, he'd shut his Bible, take his pistols, hook them back, go to the door and greet his congregation. I've often said a preacher in the pulpit with a couple of loaded flintlock pistols, he takes an offering. I guarantee you, you're giving something, right? If you're a preacher here tonight or a church leader, you might want to try that technique next Sunday. Well, Well, that's kind of an illustration of the kind of fiery man that old Caldwell was. Now, here's the thing that you must understand. Liberty comes with a pretty stiff price sometimes. And those British were serious. In fact, they hated us preachers, as I'll share with you later, because they blamed the war on us. And so when they invaded Elizabethtown, if you can believe it, one of those redcoats jumped over the fence of the Caldwell home, saw Hannah, James Caldwell's wife, through the window of the house, raised his flintlock, fired, hit her right in the chest, killing her in cold blood. It's a tragic moment. In fact, under a flag of truce, why he rode into town and helped to eulogize his wife. But then he was off to Springfield, New Jersey, because his men were engaging the British. But when he got there, he found out that his men were in a real tight spot because they were yelling, "Wadding, we need wadding for our muskets." Now, these flintlock muskets that we used were fine fighting weapons, but without the wadding to hold the shot tight, well, they were pretty useless. What were they going to do? Well, Preacher Caldwell knew what to do. He jumped on his horse and he rode down to the First Presbyterian Church of Springfield, New Jersey, ran inside and began to gather up hymn books filled with songs written by a famous hymn writer in my day, Mr. Isaac Watts. I don't know if you still sing any of Mr. Watts' songs like "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross." That's an Isaac Watts hymn. Now, what in the world is this preacher going to do with these hymn books? Well, he writes back to his men, and he begins to throw the hymn books out. His men saying, "Men, here, tear up the pages and use the pages for wadding." So get this mental picture. Here's this Presbyterian preacher throwing out hymn books at his men. They're tearing Isaac Watts hymns out, shoving them down the barrels of their flintlocks, and firing away at the British, and all the while he's yelling, "Give them Watts, boys, put Watts into it." That's the Presbyterian preacher, James Caldwell. Sad thing, though. A man that we believe the British had hired caught old Caldwell not long after that, unarmed, killed him in cold blood just like his wife. Great loss to our cause. So I'm telling you that we preachers knew that when we took our stand, there could be a great price tag attached to that stand. It was something pretty serious. I'm here to tell you that a lot of us preachers and our church men and women died for the liberties that you and I enjoy today. Let me tell you the story about a young preacher. He was only 25. His name was Joab Trout. Let's see, when was it? It was in September of 77. Let's see, we fought on the 11th, so yeah, this had to be the 10th of September. See, we were encamped on one side of Brandywine Creek, and the British were on the other. Well, we knew a fight was coming for sure. So General Washington wanted this young preacher named Joab Trout to preach a sermon to buck up the courage of the boys. So we all gathered together. General Washington was there, General Anthony Wayne, I was there, the boys were there, and old Trout got up in front of us. And this 25-year-old young man preached a powerful sermon, short, because it was late in the afternoon and the sun was setting, so we had to hurry. Well, he finally got to the end of his sermon. He finished with this powerful prayer, and then he cried out, "And God prosper the cause." Boy, I got to tell you, we were ready to fight those redcoats right then and there. But the fight would have to wait because the sun had just about set. But the very next day, September the 11th, 1777, we fought the British at the Battle of Brandywine. We showed them that we weren't going to give up our liberties without a fight. And that young preacher wanted to preach that night before old Trout. He was right there with us. He was killed that day, fighting for his liberty, mine, and the liberty that you enjoy today. So you see, when Mr. Jefferson and his committee wrote our Declaration of Independence, and in it we said that we were willing to pledge our lives and our fortunes and our sacred honor, those were more than words to us. Those were principles that we would live by and, if necessary, die for. Even we preachers. Now, you must understand that the British hated us. In fact, King George blamed the whole war on us. He was known to have said, "Well, this is nothing more than a Presbyterian rebellion." Remember, I told you the Presbyterians were the hotheads. The son of the British Prime Minister, Horace Walpole, told Parliament, "There's no use in crying about it. Cousin America has eloped with a Presbyterian parson." We thought it rather funny that they just blamed it all on the Presbyterians. Here I am, a Lutheran, the Baptists, as you'll see, Congregationalists. We were all involved. Now, some of you may be wondering, where did that title, Black Regiment, come from? Well, obviously it refers to the black robes that we preached in on Sunday mornings. If you can believe it was an American, Peter Oliver over there in Massachusetts. He sided with the redcoats. We called them Tories, and they were turncoats as far as we were concerned. And he came up with the title, Black Regiment, not as a compliment, but I think to paint a target on our chests. But you know, I believe that title has become a name that a preacher or a church leader, or for that matter, just a Christian man or woman ought to be able to wear with pride and honor. Now, don't get me wrong, there never was a regiment of preachers. No, it was we preachers that were helping to recruit and lead regiments out onto the battlefield. Some of the preachers were like me and became part of the regular army. Others were in the militia, so they would come in and out of the war and fight with us when we needed a lot of help out there on the battlefield. Now, about now, you're probably saying, preachers leading soldiers out on the field and fighting? Well, I've never heard of such. Well, I'm here to tell you there's a lot of your history that you haven't been told. Now, let me illustrate this to you. Let's go back to, say, April the 18th, 1775. You say, well, what is so special about April the 18th, 1775? Well, on a starry night, a few horsemen are riding through the Massachusetts countryside yelling, "The regulars are out! The regulars are coming!" One of those was named Revere. Paul Revere. Right. Now you say, oh, well, I know all about Paul Revere. Well, all right, let's see if you do. The night that Revere rode into Lexington, Massachusetts, he rode up to that very house. You say, well, what is so special about that house? Well, there's where the preacher, Jonas Clark, lived. The preacher in Lexington. You say, well, why is he riding up to his house? Well, you see, Preacher Clark, along with the help of a deacon named Captain John Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, had been training the men of his church and of the community how to fight together as soldiers. They were calling themselves Minutemen. Who forgot to tell you that the famous Lexington Minutemen were led and trained by a preacher and a deacon? Oh, but the plot thickens. The night that Revere rides up, Preacher Clark has two special guests staying with him, Mr. Samuel Adams, the founder and the leader of the Sons of Liberty in Boston, and Mr. John Hancock. In fact, John Hancock's grandfather had pastored that very church years before and had lived in that very house. So Revere rides up knowing that these two men are there, that Preacher Clark has been preparing these men to fight. And so he says, "Men, the regulars are out." Well, they go inside Preacher Clark's house and they have a little council of war. Hancock wanted to just fight. They finally convinced him that he had better services to offer to the cause. But they asked Preacher Clark, they said, "Well, will the men fight?" He said, "I trained them for this very hour, and they will fight, and if need be, die too under the shadow of the house of God." And so settled. They're going to make a stand. Now, I don't think that they probably intended to actually open fire onto the British. You see, the British coming into Lexington were actually on their way to Concord, and so the road forked right at Pastor Clark's church. So I think what they intended to do was to make a stand of arms to send a very strong signal that we're not going to just roll over here and give up our rights. Today, there is a statue that stands where Captain Parker and Preacher Jonas Clark made their stand right about where his church was. So the next morning, April the 19th, 1775, about 77 or so Lexington men showed up and were ready. And they're standing there staring down the muzzles of some 700 to 800 British redcoats. Well, it would have been suicidal to open fire, outnumbered like 10 to 1. So finally, Captain Parker and Preacher Clark thought that they'd made their point, and so they told the Lexington men, if they would, to disperse and go back to their homes. And so as the Lexington men were walking back, if you can believe it, someone fired a flintlock pistol. And unfortunately, the redcoats took that as a signal to open fire. And at the beginning of the battle, they began to shoot into the backs of those Lexington men. Well, what would you have done? Well, they turned around and defended themselves. And the Battle of Lexington was on, and our War of Independence had begun. You know, when that battle was over and the smoke had cleared and the dust had settled, 8 of those men had done just what their preacher had said they would do. They died under the shadow of the house of God. Another 10 had been wounded. Now, how fitting is it that our first official shots of our War of Independence were fired by Americans led by a preacher and a deacon fighting it out in the churchyard? Because that's exactly where they were. That's our first battle. Now, if you know your history, and as I mentioned a while ago, the British really were headed to Concord because they were going to go confiscate the weapons that they had heard were there, but the citizens had heard all about it. They hid them out in the woods. So the only thing the Redcoats found was the Continental Militia standing up on old Barrett Hill, where the Colonel James Barrett's farm was, overlooking the Old North Bridge. That's where the battle actually occurred in Concord. And if you can believe it, there's another preacher. He lived about 200 yards from the Old North Bridge. His name was Preacher William Emerson. You might recognize the name because his grandson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, became a famous poet and wrote the Concord hymn that talks about the shot heard round the world. You say, well, what's that preacher doing up there with the militia? Well, he's there to encourage them. He said, men, we must stand our ground, and if we're going to die, well, then let us die here. Well, I'm happy to tell you that eventually that militia marched down off of Barrett Hill and fought those British right there at the Old North Bridge and gave them a licking for sure. So much so that those Redcoats began to march all the way back to Boston. Unfortunately for them, Minutemen groups all over the area had heard what happened in Lexington that morning, and now they're lining the road, fighting a running battle with the British. Many of these groups led by preachers, or preachers in the mix. In fact, a little portion of that road has been preserved, I hear, that you could go visit today. It's called Battle Road. We were there, front and center, very first day of our War of Independence. Now, we didn't stop either. In fact, a few weeks later, there was a fight right outside of Boston. I hear that the town of Boston has grown so much that it swallowed up the old battlefield, but we fought right outside of Boston in a battle that I hear you call Bunker Hill. Was actually fought first on Breed's Hill and then eventually ended up on Bunker Hill. That painter that I mentioned a while ago, Mr. Trumbull, he painted a poignant moment in that battle. And if you'll look to the left-hand upper corner in that painting, you'll see a gentleman who's surrounded by arms and flagpoles. And if you look very closely, you'll notice that he's wearing a pair of preaching bands. You know why? Because Mr. Trumbull knew the role that we preachers were playing, and he wanted everybody to know. And so he put a preacher in the painting. That's Dr. Samuel McClintock. He is a preacher from New Hampshire, and he was there leading his men to fight. In fact, his family was so committed to the cause that they lost 3 of their 4 sons throughout the war. He wasn't the only preacher. He was there. David Avery was there from Vermont, standing up on the mounds of dirt with his arms lifted up to heaven, asking God to give us the victory, all while the musket balls were whizzing all around him, but he wanted his men to see him. Now, we had a big fight on our hands, and there were a lot of problems. And I understand that there are things you misunderstand about our generation. And one of them is that you believe that we loved and wanted to protect and to promote slavery. It's not true. In fact, if you'll notice in this painting again, back in the right-hand corner, Mr. Trumbull painted a black man right there. Notice him looking up over the shoulder of this gentleman. You say, well, what's so important about that? Well, you see, we knew what an evil slavery was, but it had been in the colonies for over 200 years, and you don't just snap your fingers and get rid of an evil like that. I understand that you, of all things, murder your preborn children. And I understand that it hasn't been so easy for you to get rid of that scourge either. So you understand these ingrained sins are terrible. Well, this black man in this painting here is actually one of our own soldiers. His name was Peter Salem. You see, the blacks in the colonies knew that their only hope for liberty was if we won the war against Great Britain. Because if you can believe it, King George wouldn't let us outlaw slavery. It was going to be in our Declaration of Independence. It was the 28th grievance. But Mr. Jefferson was convinced by others that if he included it, we'd lose 3 of the southern colonies, and that would leave us with only 10. And we felt like we needed every hand, every colony that we could. But the free black men understood, and they knew that ultimately, if we won, there was a chance for their liberty. In fact, you might say that the first official casualty of our War of Independence was this man right here, Crispus Attucks. He was killed in the Boston Massacre as a free black man. Old Prince Estabrook, he was a free black man who fought with us at Lexington. Now, General Washington had a very effective spy ring, and one of those most effective spies was this gentleman right here, James Armistead. Free black man. He was a double agent. In fact, the information that he brought us was so valuable that it played a critical role in our victory at Yorktown, which ultimately, kind of led to the end of our war and established our independence. Now, sadly, in my day, slavery was still a scourge, and there weren't hardly any black pastors, but there were black preachers. And here's one of them, Lemuel Haynes. He was a black man, a black preacher. He was also a soldier in our Continental Army, but I'm happy to tell you that when we won the war and our colonies became states, he became the first black man to pastor a white congregation in America. And I hear that finally you dealt with that evil of slavery, and it's gone, thank God. It is gone. Well, there was much to accomplish. This is Naphtali Daggett. He was a preacher and the president of Yale. When the British invaded New Haven, Connecticut, he and about 100 boys from the school rode out and fired a few shots at the British to slow them down so the citizens could get out of New Haven. But sadly, they captured that preacher, and the British beat him so brutally he never recovered and died a few months later. The president of Yale. I can tell you story after story after story. This is John Adams. He was from Durham, New Hampshire. You talking about fighting people? We preachers were. In fact, before the war ever started, this preacher went out with the men of his church and gathered up all the ammo and hid it so the British couldn't get it. I'm told that he hid the gunpowder under his pulpit. So get this, every Sunday, he's standing on hundreds of pounds of gunpowder while he's preaching these fiery sermons, and wonder how he made a spark blow the church sky high. But I hear that your modern preachers, most of them are so watered down, they'd be in no such danger. You couldn't make a spark with them if you doused them with kerosene and threw a torch on them. But not me, and not our preachers. We didn't have this, what do you call this, separation of church and state? Nonsense. Political correctness. Let me tell you what we were concerned about. Biblical correctness is what we were concerned about. So we weren't gonna roll over. I can tell you about old John Treadwell. He was a pastor over in Lynn, Massachusetts. I'm told that he kept a loaded flintlock like this one. This is a 78 caliber carried by Lieutenant William Perkins at Bunker Hill. So he kept a loaded flintlock like this leaning in his pulpit. And so every Sunday when he went up there to preach, I'm told that he had his Bible tucked under one arm and his cartridge box under the other. I guess he figured he wanted all the ammo that he could possibly need for whatever fight was coming his way while he was up there preaching. Jonathan French was a pastor from over in Andover, Massachusetts. When he heard about the Battle of Bunker Hill, you know what he did? He resigned his church, went home and got his flintlock and his medical bag and marched off and joined the army. Friends, this was happening all over the colonies. We were a bold lot, probably best illustrated by this preacher right here. This is preacher John Cleveland from Ipswich, Massachusetts. It's a crude drawing of him, but his story is so important. You see, King George had made the British General Thomas Gage the, what do they call him, dictator of Massachusetts. And since they blamed the war on preachers, he made it pretty hard on men like old Cleveland. So Preacher Cleveland wanted to write a letter of protest to General Gage. Now, how's he going to get a letter to that British general? Oh, then he landed on the idea. He would simply publish the letter in the newspaper, and not only could General Gage read the letter, but all the other citizens could read it as well. So I want you to get just a little flavor of this preacher's letter to General Gage.
General Gage, thou profane, wicked monster of falsehood. Your late infamous proclamation is as full of notorious lies as a toad or a rattlesnake of deadly poison. You are an abandoned wretch. Without speedy repentance, you will have an aggravated damnation in hell.
I've often said, Preacher Cleveland, why don't you tell him what you really think, right? Do you realize he could have been executed for that? But you see, to us, I must tell you that to us preachers in my day, there were some things more important to us than approval and applause. Things like principle. Well, it wasn't just Lutherans and Presbyterians. The Baptists got involved. Charles Thompson over in Warren, Rhode Island, when the British came in there, they did what they did in a lot of towns. They either burned or desecrated the church. They burned his church and his house. So he joined the Continental Army. Unfortunately, he was captured and thrown on a prison ship. I don't know how much you know about these prison ships, but were they terrible places. If you ask me, those soldiers met a fate worse than death itself. We lost hundreds of patriots on those ships. You know what the highest death rate, though, was? Among the preachers. They hated us preachers. And old Charles Thompson was thrown on one of those prison ships, like old Moses Allen and a lot of other preachers that I could tell you about. Well, here's another Baptist preacher. His name was Joab Houghton. He pastored the First Baptist Church of Hopewell, New Jersey. This actually is his church right there. Well, 4 days after the battles of Lexington and Concord, so we're talking April 23rd, 1775, old Houghton gathered the men of his church together and stood right there on that rock. Now, that rock used to be in front of the church. Today, it's on the top of, well, as you can see, a memorial, rehearsing what he did. So here he's standing on that rock, addressing the men of his church, and he said, "Men of New Jersey, the redcoats are murdering our brethren in New England. Who follows me to Boston?" I'm told that every member of Houghton's church went home, hugged their families goodbye, got their flintlocks packed, and followed their preacher off to fight for liberty. Up and down the colonies, this was happening. In fact, in that terribly cold winter of 1777-78, at a place called Valley Forge, when, to be honest with you, we didn't think it was ever going to stop snowing, when we were freezing and starving to death. It was preachers like me and Houghton that kept ministering to General Washington and his staff and to the troops as they continued to drill, because we knew we had to help hold that army together so we could fight again that next spring. And thank God we were successful. And I'm convinced that a good part of the reason why that army held together was because of the ministry of we preachers like myself and Houghton and others. So you see, when I tell you that we were pivotal in the fight, that's not an overstatement. In fact, I hear that if you visit Valley Forge today, you can tour the reconstructed Muhlenberg Brigade Barracks, where my men and I spent that terribly cold winter of 77, 78. Well, I guess what I'm trying to tell you is we were fighters. We had a fighting spirit. Probably no better illustrated than by this preacher right here. This is Preacher Thomas Allen from Pittsfield, Massachusetts. As you can see, he was not only the chaplain, but he was the commander of the Berkshire Militia. To show you what a fighter he was, at the Battle of Bennington, Vermont on August the 16th, 1777, notice what he does. He leads his men out onto the battlefield to fight wearing his preaching robe. Once his men are lined up, he walks out into the killing zone between the two armies. His men thought he'd lost his mind, jumped up onto a stump, and guess what he did? He offered the British the opportunity to surrender before telling his men to open fire. Well, somebody recognized him and said, "Well, there's old Preacher Allen, somebody on Poppy." And if you can believe it, they fired a volley of musket fire at that preacher standing there on that stump. It's a wonder they hadn't killed him. Musket balls whizzing everywhere. I did hear that one of them put a hole in his hat. Infuriated, he walked back to his brother Joseph and he said, "Now, Joe, you know that I'm a better shot than you, so you load and I'll shoot." And he and his brother fought all day long at the Battle of Bennington, Vermont, as they returned the favor. Well, after the battle was over, he helped to care for the wounded, and then toward the end of the week, he had to saddle up and ride back to his church. Had to preach. It was Sunday. When he got there, an irate church member confronted him and said, "Preacher, have you ever heard a church member talk kind of like that? Preacher, I need to have a word with you." He said, "Well, okay, of course. What is it?" He said, "Well, I heard the other day that you fought like a common soldier over there at Bennington. What do you have to say for yourself?" He said, "Well, of course I did. Every man had to do his duty." He said, "But you're a preacher. Surely you didn't kill anybody, did you?" Allen said, "I don't know if I killed anybody, but I did notice behind a particular bush there was a frequent flash, and every time that flash occurred, one of our men would fall. I took steady aim and fired at that bush. I don't know if I killed anybody, but I put out that flash." That's Preacher Thomas Allen. I mean, I just got to tell you, there's a time when you have to stand up for what's right, you know. Now, some of you are saying, "Well, where in the world did preachers like you come from? I've never heard of such. Well, you have to understand that a few years before our War of Independence, a revival swept through the colonies. I understand that you call it the First Great Awakening. Hundreds, thousands of men and women were being birthed into God's kingdom. Some of the greatest preachers in our history were preaching in those days. Men like Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, George Whitefield, Jonathan Mayhew. And some of us Black Road guys later were just boys then. We grew up in that kind of a revival atmosphere. So when the time came to stand up for our liberties, we were ready. We were ready. Well, before I finish my part of this talk here tonight, I have to be honest with you and tell you that I wasn't the only preacher in my family. Now, of course, I told you that my father, Henry, helped to found the Lutheran Church in Pennsylvania. But you see, I had other brothers, and one of those brothers was also a preacher. His name was Frederick Muhlenberg. But he was very different from me. He was a preacher in New York City. He was a city preacher, and he didn't believe that preachers ought to get involved in politics and war. In fact, he said so to one of our other brothers, which incredibly infuriated me. And so I wrote him a letter. In fact, I was reading a part of this letter to you when we first started our conversation. I said in it, Frederick, wouldn't you sooner fight like a man than die like a dog? You say, well, it caused him to see the light. I don't know, but he soon felt the heat because the British invaded New York City not long after that. And they did there what they did in most every town. They either desecrated or burned the churches, and my brother barely got out of there alive with his family. Now what does my fancy pants preaching brother have to say about himself getting involved and how it's beneath the man of the cloth to get involved in politics and war? Well, after he had that kind of a close shave, he immediately became a member of the Continental Congress. And then my brother became a member of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. And my brother, who said preachers shouldn't get involved, when the war was over, became the first Speaker of the House of the United States of America and is one of the original signers of the Bill of Rights. Quite a turnaround, wouldn't you agree? I've had a lot ask me, well, Pete, do you think it was your example that turned old Frederick around? Oh, I'd love to hope so, but I don't think that's what it was. See, here's what I think it was. I think my brother got pinched so hard, and it hurt. He nearly lost everything. So here's my question to your generation. How hard are you going to have to be pinched? You going to wait till you nearly lose everything? My brother almost did. My generation of preachers and churchmen and women did our duty for truth and liberty. My question is, will your generation do your duty? That's my question. Friends, I have been a pastor, been a preacher since I was 16. I'll turn 63 this August. I was vocationally in the ministry by the time I was 22. And the amazing thing is, I spent the majority of that time a really enthusiastic student of history. I've always really enjoyed history, having never heard of any of these preachers I've been talking about tonight. I didn't even hear about these guys until about 2007. Now, how is it that a guy like me could live my whole life and not hear about the role that the preachers and the churches played in the War of Independence? I'll tell you, because we've allowed it to be taken from us. And I think it was on purpose. Because you see, if I was a communist, I'd want the preachers to shut up. My goodness, the last thing I'd want is for the churches to get involved. How is it that I didn't know about black robe preachers like this guy right here? He's an Episcopalian. You got to remember, the black robe preachers, not all of them were on the battlefield. Some of them were fighting in the pulpit. Some of them were fighting in the halls of Continental Congress. Listen to what old William Smith said here. We know that our civil and religious rights are linked together in one indissoluble bond, and they'll either flourish or fall together in America. How is it that we have lost that truth? See, we seem to be under the mistaken notion that as long as we can hang on to our churches, it really doesn't matter what happens out there in the culture, we'll be okay. Not true. See, this is why they preached election sermons. When was the last time you heard or you preached an election sermon? Separation of church and state. Separation of church and state, which we will deal with tomorrow. It's a lie. It's a myth. But you see, we have heard it for so long, we've come to believe it. When you read these preachers' writings, here's what you'll find. They talked about and emphasized two kinds of liberty. Well, they talked about civil and religious liberty. And they kind of saw liberty like a train. At least in our day, we would. And as long as those two rails of civil and religious liberty are secure, that train can go right down the tracks. But if you surrender one of those rails, you know what happens to that train? Of course, runs off the tracks. And if you'll look around you, friend, that's what's happening to liberty in America today. It's running off the rails. It's a Presbyterian preacher named John Witherspoon. He was a member of the Continental Congress. He's the only vocational preacher that we know of that signed the Declaration of Independence. He was also the president of what became Princeton. I want you to listen to what he said. There's not a single instance in history in which civil liberty was lost and religious liberty was preserved entire. Now, what's he trying to tell us? He's trying to tell us that if you start cutting up liberties and saying, well, we'll hang on to this one, we'll let that one go, you lose them all. You see, they're intricately woven together. Now, you know this, but God created three institutions that work like a three-legged stool so we can have a civil society. The home, the state or civil government, and the church. Those are all three institutions of God. And it is just as biblical to preach on proper government as it is to preach about the church or the family. But for at least the last 100 years, we've told preachers, oh, no, you can't preach politics in the church, as if we don't want to know God's opinion on government. So, since we've been silent, here's what's happened. That institution has risen up and it's trying to exterminate the other two. It's trying to destroy the church and the family. And this was inevitable. We should have seen it coming. If we'd have lived before the war between the states, we'd have known all about the preachers of the Revolution. Look at this historian, 1862, Frank Moore. The preachers of the Revolution did not hesitate to attack the great political and social evils of their day. Today, the average preacher won't touch them with a 10-foot pole. 2 years before this, John Wingate Thornton, the fathers of the Republic, did not divorce politics and religion. They denounced the separation as ungodly. What are we told? The opposite of that, separation of church and state. Separation of church and state. And so, we've kept out of politics. Now that's devastating when you live in a republic, because you see, a republic depends on its citizens being engaged. Adrian Rogers, who pastored for years in Memphis, once said, it was God who created human government. It's therefore inconceivable that he'd create government and tell his people to stay out of it. But that's exactly what we've done. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. By the way, notice he didn't say salt of the church, light of the church. He said salt of the earth, light of the world. Now, what happens to any part of the culture when there's no salt? Decay, right? And what happens when there's no light? Darkness. So what do we all say? Well, politics is a dirty business. Well, of course it is. We took all the salt and light out of it. And so we've left it to the pagans to govern. And here's the thing about a republic. We get the kind of government we deserve. Why would we only want to be governed by pagans and want Christians to stay out of it? I want to be governed by godly people. And by the way, that's not just a Dan Fisherism. Proverbs 29:2, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when a wicked man rules, what happens to the people? They groan. Can anybody say Joe Biden or Kamala Harris? Friends, what's happening now was predictable. And yet, half or more of Christians don't even vote. And that's the lowest level of citizenship. You know, Daniel Webster once said that what makes men good Christians makes them good citizens. Well, we're lousy citizens today, so I guess that means we're not very good Christians. And it's costing us, friends. Now, what happens when the church goes silent? All you have to do is look at 1930s and 40s Germany. Can you believe this? While the Nazis were rising to power, look at this, cardinals and bishops standing there doing the Heil Hitler salute. I guess they figured if they could stay neutral with the Nazis, everything would be okay. Listen to what Adolf Hitler said about the preachers. He said, the parsons will dig their own graves. They will betray their God to us. They will betray anything for the sake of their miserable jobs and incomes. He read them about right. It was a dark day in Germany. Oh, there were a few lights. Men like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a Lutheran preacher. His books are still used today in Christian circles all over the world. He was a part of some of the failed attempts to assassinate Hitler. Lutheran preacher. They captured him. They threw him in prison camp. And they hanged him with a piano string just 2 weeks before the Allied forces liberated his prison. What happened in Germany? I can tell you what happened. In my opinion, the church waited too long to stand up. Is that what we're going to do? We're going to wait too long? Friends, I'm not sure we almost already haven't waited too long. But as long as there's breath, we must stand. Samuel Adams never claimed to be a prophet, but he did say something one time that was very prophetic. He said, if ever a time should come that vain and aspiring men possess the highest seats in government, our country will stand in need of its most experienced patriots to prevent its ruin. You know what he's talking about? Us. We've been liberated internally by the blood of Jesus. We ought to love liberty more than anybody else in America. Christians ought to be leading the fight, not bringing up the caboose. You say, well, you know, the government there in D.C., the government at the state capitol. Friends, the government in America is not in D.C. or at your state capitol or mine. You know where the government is? Right here. In a republic, the government is of, by, and for the people. Jesus says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and, not or, and to God the things that are God's. Who's Caesar in America? We are. Do you realize if we don't get involved in a republic, we're disobeying Jesus' command to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's? And all the while, we thought that we were being pious and super spiritual by staying out of dirty politics. Yeah, and we sold the country down the river in the process. That's why it is so important for Christians to be engaged. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that government has all the answers, but friends, it's one of three legs. What happens to a three-legged stool when you remove one leg? Falls over. So why is it preachers won't speak out? Well, in 2014, George Barna, Paul mentioned him a while ago, did a study of preachers, and he asked preachers, he said, look, does the Bible address the social ills of our day? And they mostly said yes. He said, well, are you going to preach on them? And they mostly said no. He said, why not? Here's the top two reasons that pastors in America gave for not preaching on controversial subjects. They said, number one, it'll hurt our attendance, and number two, it'll hurt the size of our offerings. Right. Jesus didn't die for either one of those. Do you know who's concerned about those? Hirelings. What did Jesus say about a hireling? He'll watch the sheep for a paycheck, but if he sees the predator approaching, he'll abandon the sheep to save his own hide and leave them to the wolf. What does he say about the good shepherd? Oh, he'll fight for the sheep. And if need be, he'll die for the sheep. We have a lot of hirelings pastoring our churches today instead of men of God. So, what do we do? Well, we stand. And that's what we're going to be talking about all day tomorrow. How do you do that? What are the nuts and bolts of being a modern black robe preacher? Well, we need to wrap it up here tonight. So I want to tell one more story. So I want us to go back in time. Let's go back to the 18th century. So let's kind of imaginary travel. Here we are back in the 18th century. You say, well, where are we going? Well, we're going to rural New Jersey, to a place called the Forks of the Delaware, where a preacher by the name of John Rossbrook lived. He actually lived in that house right there. We don't have a portrait of him, but we do have one. That's his son, James. And so he was never like Muhlenberg, regular military, so he would have not been wearing a colonial officer's uniform, probably wouldn't have worn a military tricorn hat. No, he had worn a parson's hat like this. And he was, well, let me just allow him to tell you his story. I'd been preaching these principles from my pulpit for years. We saw what was coming. And just as sure as we dreaded it, the war hit our colonies like a wave on the shore. Well, I was 63. I felt that was just a little too old to go marching off to war. So I told the younger men in my church, I said, men, you go fight, and I'll make this deal with you. I will stay here and watch over your families. I thought that was a fair trade. At least I did until the Battle of Long Island, New York. Now, I don't know how much you know about that battle, but General Washington and our boys were nearly annihilated, and had it not been for a number of miracles, they would have been. I realized then every able-bodied man had to do his duty. I called the rest of my men back together. I said, men, we must rally to the aid of General Washington and to liberty. The men of my church said, preacher, we'll go if you'll lead us. And I said, it'll be my distinct honor. And so at the age of 63, I saddled up and we rode off to try to find General Washington and the army. We found him right outside of Trenton, New Jersey. We were involved in that battle with those British and Hessians on December 26, 1776 at Trenton, New Jersey. And we won that fight. But most people don't know that a week later, the Hessians tried to retake Trenton in what we call the Second Battle of Trenton. And during that fight, I got separated by our men, by our army, and was on the wrong side of a creek trapped with the British. Now, I knew if I tried to cross that creek in the daylight, they'd catch me in the middle of that creek and they would kill me for certain, because I hated us preachers. So what I decided that I'd do was I'd simply ride and try to evade capture until the sun set. And then once the sun had set, I'd make a mad dash for that creek. They'd hear me as I crossed, but they wouldn't know till I was already safe on the other side. So, what I did, I rode all day long, and I was successful in evading capture. But you know, toward the end of the day, I hadn't had anything to drink, nothing to eat, and so I rode up to an old tavern, and I thought, well, maybe I can run in there and get me coffee or tea or water, just anything, and maybe a piece of bread, and just kind of get my energy back up and get ready for this dash. Well, I tied off my horse. I went in, I found something, but when I came out, you'll never believe, my horse was gone. Well, I couldn't take somebody else's horse. Well, hoping that he had just pulled free, I went walking out through the woods because, you know, trapped afoot on the wrong side, I'm a dead man for sure. Well, I pushed my way through a particularly thick growth of bushes, and you will never believe what I found waiting for me on the other side. A squad of Hessian soldiers. There was nowhere for me to go. I couldn't run. I was trapped. So I thought, well, I'll just plead mercy. You got to know these Hessians were German mercenaries that had come over to America. British had brought them over to terrorize us, and it worked because we were terrified. They were ruthless on the battlefield. I said, please take me as your prisoner. They just laughed at me. I could see they meant to do me harm. Well, I asked them if I could pray before they did whatever they were going to do. The reason my story is known is because one of these Hessians went into Trenton later bragging about what they had done. To my surprise, they said, sure. I knelt there on the ground. What do you pray? How do you pray when you're about to meet a pretty brutal death? Well, I did what you would do. I prayed. I started praying out loud. I said, Lord, please receive my soul, which is about to come to you. Watch over my family, my church, Lord. Help us to win this fight. We got to win this fight. Well, you know, all kinds of thoughts are going through your mind. And I remembered the words of Jesus on the cross. You remember when he asked the Father not to blame those that had crucified him? I prayed the same thing. Those Hessians had moved in very close for the kill, and I said, Lord, please do not blame these men for my death. You know, you'd think that might have melted those old stony cold heart Hessians. Didn't make a dent. Just as soon as I finished my prayer, The British commander that was over those men yelled, "Take him." They jumped on me and they began to bayonet me to death. When my body was found later, there were 17 bayonet wounds. One of the bayonets had been driven into my body and the Hessian had broken it off. 3 sword gashes across my face. In fact, it was another Black Robe preacher by the name of George Duffield, along with my wife and her brother, who found my body buried in a temporary battlefield grave and buried me in Trenton, New Jersey, where I await the resurrection. See, when we rode off to fight for liberty, we knew that some of us most likely would be wounded. But we also knew that probably some of us would die. But you know, you just don't want to think about that. You kind of push that out of your mind. But the truth is, there were many of us preachers and churchmen and women who died for liberty. And so I would ask you, in your age, if my generation of preachers was, well, if we were willing to die for liberty, is it too much to ask you to stand up and speak out for it? Is that too much? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have heard an amazing story tonight. A story of a time when the church was the tip of the spear, led by the preachers. This is why Paul and I literally travel all over the country telling this story, because we believe that the time is, and it's past time, to bring back the spirit of the old Black Robe Regiment. None of us wants a war, but I'm telling you, friends, if we don't start engaging, one's going to be thrown on us. We're going to lose it all. So you say, well, what am I to do? Oh, well, there are a lot of things that we can do. You know, Isaiah one time said that he heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Who will we send? And who will go for us?" You remember what Isaiah said? "Here I am, Lord, send me." Some of you ought to run for office. Some of you ought to run for your legislature. Some of you ought to run for the school board, city council, mayor. Why shouldn't you run? This is what our framers intended, citizen legislators. You say, well, Dan, I've really prayed about that, and I don't think that that's what God wants me to do. Okay, fine. Then you need to help recruit those who are called and get them elected. But we must engage. So every one of us has a job to do. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do tonight. We're going to close here momentarily, but I'm going to ask you, if you will, to just bow your heads. Would you do that right now? And I want you to spend just a moment, and I want you to ask the Lord. See if you can't hear him saying, "Who will we send? Who will go for us?" And then I'll close this in prayer.
There's a call for men to be in a land where all are free. There is hope for liberty if we go.
Well, Father,
there's a dream.
We've heard an amazing story again tonight. We want to thank you, Lord, for our heritage. Thank you that you sent your son, that he was willing to fight the fight for us. Now, Lord, you're calling us. So many of us, Lord, have taken our liberties for granted. We've been apathetic. Some of us have just been downright cowardly and greedy. We're just afraid of what it will cost us. But Father, I pray that tonight we would hear your voice louder than ever. Lord, I pray that you would raise up the spirit of the old Black Robe Regiment, fill our hearts and our backbones with courage and passion, and that we would stand. And Lord, we know that in the end, it's not just government, it's the gospel. But you created government so we could have a civil society so we can preach the gospel. And if preaching the gospel is the most important thing, then surely the second most important thing is to defend the freedom to do the most important thing. So, Father, help us tonight. Would you speak to us? Push us out of our comfort zones and help us to do what we know we ought to do. And Lord, in the words of Joab Trout from September the 10th, 1777, I ask you, God, prosper the cause. In Jesus' name we pray. And everybody said, amen. I want to thank you for allowing me to come here tonight to Lindale, Texas, to share the amazing story of the Black Robe Regiment. God bless you as we stand together for liberty. Thank you so much. God bless you. God bless you. God bless you. Okay, right here before we're dismissed, thank you so much. This is my website right here. And so there are cards back there at the book table. And if you're interested in finding out more, you can go there. I wrote a book that details the story. It's a textbook. Men, I've done all the research for you. It's all there. We hired a movie company to make a docudrama that kind of tells this story that you saw tonight from about a 30,000 foot level. You saw a little bit of the movie at the beginning of my presentation tonight. It's back there in Blu-ray, which is the high definition, and then the older DVD format of low res. And then I just released a book about Romans 13. I'll be teaching on that tomorrow. Does the Bible teach that we're just to roll over and play dead and we just have to do whatever those in power say we're supposed to do? Is that what the Bible really says?